In this presentation, we'll be talking about modulation. You'll notice it's titled Modulation 1. We'll be covering Modulation 2, which includes lots of more intense chromatic types of modulations later on in another presentation. Modulation is the process by which a shift in tonal center is established. When I refer to a shift in tonal center, that means we're changing which pitch is the tonic. So in a modulation, a new pitch is elevated to the status of tonic. Thus, we imply a new key area, and therefore a new harmonic hierarchy relative to the new tonic. If we were in D major, everything would be related to that tonic pitch of D. However, if we modulate away from D major, all those relationships, tonic, predominant, and dominant relationships in D major, would no longer be the hierarchy that we'd be using. So if we move from D major to A major, for instance, we'd have A major as the new tonic, and all the new hierarchies based on that key. Tonic, predominant, dominant, and then back to tonic. Typically, modulations are established by a cadence, usually an authentic one, though sometimes through a half cadence. Using a strong or structural cadence, like an authentic cadence, allows the new key area to be heard as a point of arrival. This, in some ways, can be seen as the opposite of tonicization. Tonicization is what we had when we were dealing with secondary dominance and secondary diminished seventh chords. We had a relatively brief emphasis on a new key area, but usually without a structural cadence. So as I said, when we use secondary dominance, we are temporarily tonicizing a pitch, but we tend to not have a strict, authentic, or established cadence that points us to this as a new fundamental key area. Rather, it's just a brief foray into this colorful key. So we can see tonicization and modulation as two opposite ends of a continuum. On one side, we have tonicization. This is a brief emphasis, perhaps simply a progression or short passage, and it typically is not going to involve a cadence. Meanwhile, with modulation, we have structural emphasis. This is articulated via a cadence, and often has a prolonged emphasis relative to the surrounding music, meaning that this movement to the new key area relative to the surrounding music seems important. And it's accompanied by a new tonal hierarchy in the new key. So we now have tonic, predominant, and dominant relationships in that new key area. There are a number of types of modulatory procedures that are utilized in the Common Practice era. Right now, we'll discuss those commonly used in the Baroque and Classical era, and others we'll save until we discuss Romantic harmony. Here we'll talk about common or pivot chord modulations. These are the most common ones. We'll also discuss chromatic modulations, sequential modulations, and phrase or direct modulations. Let's begin with the common chord modulation, which is the most common type that you'll likely encounter looking at Baroque and Classical music. Modulation by common chord utilizes a harmony that naturally occurs both in the first key and the second key. So the home key that you were in and the new key to which we are modulating. And though the pitches of that specific chord will be the same, whether you interpret it in the old key or new key, the function will be different. For instance, let's imagine D major. In this case, we can imagine a B minor triad, B, D, F sharp. In this case, it occurs in D major as 6. If we were to modulate to A major, we would then reinterpret that B minor chord as 2, built on the second scale degree. Therefore, this can be used as a common chord between the two keys. It occurs naturally in each. We don't have to change any pitches in order for it to occur naturally in either scale. It occurs as 6 in D major and as 2 in A major. Thus, the common chord modulation creates a very smooth modulatory process. For the analysis of common chord modulations, we need to indicate at least 3 aspects. First, we want to indicate the key to which we are modulating. Then we want to indicate the function of the chord in the new key and the function of the chord in the old key. To use this, we use a zigzag line as seen below. Now, let's walk through this a little bit. So here is the third movement from Mozart's Piano Sonata in D major, K284, and this is the theme from a theme and variation section. Now, by the end of the passage, I believe that we can hear that we have moved to A major. We have a perfect authentic cadence in our new key. So we can now figure out, well, if we're moving to A major, then there needs to be a modulation indicated at some point along the way. The strategy that's commonly used for this, and you'll develop strategies of your own and you'll get more and more used to finding these modulations, but one common strategy is to find, once we've found the key to which we're moving, in this case A major, what we can do is we can find the first dominant that we have in that key, or at least the first harmony in which we have some altered tones. So in this case, I see that this is a 5-7 chord in the key of A major. We have E, G sharp, B, and D, which I'm highlighting here with the mouse pointer. So we have this chord, E, G sharp, B, and D, and we know for sure that chord does not occur naturally in D major, back in our home key. It doesn't occur there because simply we've got an accidental. We've got that G sharp there, that doesn't occur naturally in D major. So we can't use this chord as the pivot chord. Remember, the pivot chord needs to function both in the old key and the new key. However, what we can often do is find this dominant chord, the chord that has some altered tone in it, and we go back one space. And if we go back one chord, typically what's going to happen then is that there's going to be a predominant chord preceding that dominant. If there's not, and if it still feels, well, you know, there's still altered tones here, just keep on going back until you find one that could possibly work. But oftentimes this strategy works very well. Find the first dominant that appears in the new key, go back one step, and see if that chord works in both keys. In this case, we can look down here in the Alberti bass in the left hand. We've got a D, a B, and an F sharp. There's our B minor chord that we were just talking about before. So we have here this B minor chord, and we know this works as a 6-6 back in the home key of D. And we know it works as a 2-6 in the new key of A, where we're heading towards in the next cadence. So we can take this and say, okay, here is our pivot chord. This chord is functioning as a 6-6 in the old key and as a 2-6 in the new key. We'll indicate the new key by writing it here. We'll say A, and then we'll write this zigzag line. This helps to delineate the stopping of the old function, the old key area, and the starting of the new key area down here. So we've got A major, and it's functioning in 2-6, and now we're continuing on our analysis like we were in A major. 5-7, 1-2-6, cadential 6-4, 5-7, 1. Now from the beginning, to go through the Roman numerals, we've got 1, 6, 2, 6, 5, 7, 1, 2, 6, cadential 6, 4, 5, and 1, 6. Here's our pivot chord, 6/6 in D major, and 2/6 in A major. Then our dominant in the new key, 5/7. Then 1, 2/6, cadential 6/4, 5/7, and then our nice perfect authentic cadence on 1. So, as I mentioned, there are a few helpful things to remember when approaching common chord modulation. First, identify the keys involved. What key do we begin in? What key do we end in? Listen for cadences and delineate those two extremes so then you can work inwards and find where the pivot chord is. Next, find the chord that functions better, i.e. more diatonically in the new key rather than the old key. This will tend to be the chord after the common chord. So if we find the chord that functions better, for instance, this was the 5/7 in the new key, we can go back one chord. This harmony will tend to be the common chord. If you don't think it is, double check, then keep going back chords. It's best, again, to figure out the outer bounds and then work towards the middle to see what's involved. Rather than working from one starting point and just going and going and going, we often can get confused as to when exactly the appropriate moment for modulation is. It's also good to play through the music or sing through the music or listen to a recording so that we have an aural input as well. So we're not just playing with pitches on the page, but we have a musical sensation of what's going on. Let your ear guide you in some of this, and if that's creating problems, go back to using your eye and use your analytical techniques. But going back and forth, it will be a really great use for you. Let's go on now to chromatic modulations. Chromatic modulations are sometimes known as modulation by altered chord. And there's some argument about how to analyze chromatic modulations in the best possible way. I'll present a few methods here, but just know that different people have different perspectives on chromatic modulations. Some methods recommend it is best to understand chromatic modulations this way. The introduction of a new key without the use of a pivot chord by means of a chord that has one pitch chromatically altered from the previous harmony. In this way, the new key is simply indicated underneath the music and a Roman numeral analysis follows. For now, I recommend using this method. Some methods will still use the same analytical technique as common chord modulations, but noting that in this case there is no diatonic pivot chord. We'll focus on exploring this method further when we get to more complicated chromatic modulations used in the Romantic era, but for now I recommend if you encounter a modulation where there's no pivot chord, just simply write the new key that you're in and indicate that it is a chromatic modulation. That's probably going to be the safest for now. There's also sequential modulations. When a musical passage is restated, beginning at a different pitch level, usually up or down a step, it is known as a sequence. And if the sequence is used to create a cadence in a different key area, then this is a sequential modulation. Such modulations can simply be marked sequential or just SEQ, and then along with indicating the new key. The important thing is here in your analysis to be aware that there's no pivot chord, and instead this is the process that's being used. It may be possible that a common chord or chromatic modulation is involved in this analysis, and we just have another layer on top, in this case that we're using a sequence. And then there's also phrase or direct modulations. If there are no common chords and no sequential passages, in other words, if there's nothing to prepare the arrival of the new key, and if the key's beginning coincides with the start of a new phrase, then the modulation is considered a phrase or direct modulation. We see one here in this Bach chorale. We start in B minor at the beginning. Pretty firmly in B minor at that point. We continue onwards after the repeat sign. With cadence, you can analyze this either in D major with a tonicization of G before, and then we continue on. There we get to a half cadence in E minor. In the boxed area, I'll play from that 1/6 chord in E. And then we jump directly to A major. So we can see that ending in with that 5 chord, the half cadence in E minor, he's not resolving that at all, and he's starting the next phrase clearly in A major with the 5-6-5. Then a 1, 1-6, 4-6 with some passing tones, and then a 1, and then 2-6, 5, 1, and there's our imperfect authentic cadence. So in this case, we clearly have a phrase modulation where we end clearly with a half cadence in the old key and we begin the next phrase in the new key. Now, it is worth pointing out that there is a between the B major chord that ends the half cadence and the 5-7 chord in A, which begins the next phrase, there is a dominant relationship between those. We have a B major chord going to an E7. So if you wanted to make the argument that there was some relationship between there, maybe that you could hear that B major chord as a 5 of 5 in A major, you could, but I think the overwhelming feeling is that we end a phrase in one key and we begin the next phrase in a new key. And I think if you were singing it, if you were listening to it, if you were analyzing it, that's the overwhelming thought there. It is absolutely reasonable to say, well, there is that relationship, but for me, that feels subsidiary to the fact that we end one phrase in one key, we begin the next phrase in a new key. So these are the types of modulations that we most commonly encounter. We've got our common or pivot chord modulations. That's going to be your first try when you're analyzing a passage. See if there's a common or pivot chord modulation. And only after that, go on to see, is it a chromatic modulation? Is there an altered pitch? Is there one pitch which changes the tendency of the key and the functionality? Is there a sequence involved as we move from key to key? In that case, it could be a sequential modulation. Or does one phrase come to an end in one key and the next phrase begin in a new key? In that case, it would be a phrase or direct modulation.